So the GOP has officially released its preliminary budget proposal, and it's just not that great. At least not for the average American. And when these proposals, as well as policies in general, are being created, while of course every American matters, that group, the average American, is who these proposals and policies should be aimed at helping because it's the majority of this country. And this budget proposal just doesn't seem to do that. So we're going to go over all the main talking points. I'm going to give you my opinion on that, and then you are more than welcome to give me your thoughts as well in the comments below. Unfortunately, this proposal just doesn't really seem to stand for what the GOP says it stands for, which is smaller government and lower taxes. Well, I guess it does stand for that, but only if you make the top 1% of income in this country. So with that said, as always, my name is Derek, and I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. Let's go over these talking points. And the main talking points for this proposal are, of course, tax cuts, as well as how we pay for them. So this budget proposes that we cut taxes by $4.5 trillion. Now, mind you, these are over 10 years, so it wouldn't happen all at once. And of course, for most Americans, when we hear tax cuts, that sounds like a good thing because most Americans feel like they are being taxed too much or that their taxes are not necessarily going to places that benefit them. So on the surface, tax cuts are good, but it is how these tax cuts are distributed, of course, that actually matters. And when you dig into the details, the overarching majority of this $4.5 trillion in tax cuts goes to the very, very, very high income earners as well as corporations. In fact, the average tax cut for someone making over $700,000 every single year will be about $64,000 in tax reduction. But at the same time, someone earning closer to the average wage might only experience $340 in tax cuts. So while yes, tax cuts are good in general, the overarching majority of the $4.5 trillion in proposed tax cuts goes to the upper class as well as corporations. And in return, what does the middle class receive? Well, they only receive a very measly few $100s in tax cuts, while, of course, because we have to pay for those tax cuts, while spending in areas that could directly benefit the middle class, as well as lower income earners are cut drastically. One of those being Medicaid. Medicaid in this proposal would be cut by $880 billion. Again, over 10 years. But that's still a massive portion of funds that would otherwise be allocated to people who need healthcare the most, those who really can't afford it. And here's the problem. The average American, someone earning, say, $75,000 to $100,000 a year, which is really above the average, those people are much, much closer to being in a situation where they need to take advantage of Medicare than they are of being in a situation, which is on the other side, being able to benefit from some of these larger tax cuts. So while Medicaid is designed to help lower income earners with healthcare, it also affects the middle class because there are times in our history, like recessions, like economic downturns, where the middle class might have to rely on that. And the chance of that happening is, on average, way higher than a situation where those same middle class members magically start to make 10 times more than they currently make. But of course, spending cuts are required if we're going to cut taxes, because if we cut taxes, we have to balance the other side of the equation, and Medicare is one of the proposed ways and places to cut. Unfortunately, another area where a proposed cut is education. About $330 billion, again, over the next 10 years, is proposed to be cut from education in general. Now, this could lead to decreased federal support for all types of schools, K through 12, as well as higher education. And in the short term, who knows what this would do? But in the mid to long term, you might end up with a less educated population. And right now, when we're competing with other tech giants, like China, we need a more educated population to be able to, again, push for breakthroughs, push for innovation, and continue to compete on a global scale. We also have to understand that our economy is a service-based economy, with 75+% of the GDP as well as employment directly tied to services. A lot of services tend to require higher education. So in general, for the overall economy, in the mid to long term, say 5-10 years plus, cutting education spending could drastically reduce Americans' ability to compete on the global scale. And another area of spending cuts that are proposed is with the SNAP program, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, basically food stamps. Now, this program was directly designed to help low-income earners be able to eat. With that said, because of the very high-priced environment that everyone is living through because of inflation, this SNAP program has started to trickle upwards into the lower middle class. So now there are members directly of the middle class who require using SNAP to be able to supplement their nutritional needs because of inflation. So a $230 billion cut, again, over the next 10 years will affect, of course, lower income earners, but it will also further and further affect the middle class, especially if inflation is not under control over the next few years, and more importantly, especially if wages do not continue to outpace inflation, which is what we saw over the last 5 years. It's the reason why we're in this situation in the first place. It's the reason why most Americans feel like the economy is not doing so good, is because things are much too expensive and people cannot afford them with their wages. But of course, all those cuts are not enough to fund the $4.5 trillion over the next decade of tax cuts. So how else do we fund it? Of course, by adding to the national debt. This proposal includes a $4 trillion increase to the debt ceiling over the next 10 years. And that's because that's the only way to fund these tax cuts. So what you end up with is a budget proposal from the GOP, from Republicans who have traditionally represented fiscal responsibility to some degree, that instead are advocating for an increase in the national debt ceiling to then fund tax cuts, but at the same time, not to fund tax cuts for all Americans, but to fund tax cuts primarily aimed at the upper income earners and corporations. And what does that mean? Well, it means that you have the population of a country shouldering the burden of increasing the national debt ceiling to funnel tax cuts primarily to upper income earners. And that is where I have a problem with this proposal. You should either want to reduce the national debt, or if you are going to increase the national debt ceiling, you should distribute tax cuts and programs to the average American, not to the upper income earning class. And don't get me wrong, I would love to pay lower taxes, but when I make these videos, I am speaking on behalf of the average American, because the average American is simultaneously the largest group of this population, while also being the group that seems to be misrepresented or not represented in these proposals and in these policies time and time again. Now, there is one caveat here. This is coming from the GOP members in the House. There is another proposal being worked on in the Senate, and of course, I have to make this clear. While Donald Trump ran and was elected as the leader of the Republican Party, this proposal is not directly coming from him. It is coming from members of our Congress. And while Donald Trump has expressed support for some of these policies in this proposal, he hasn't expressed support for all of them, namely cutting Medicaid or any sort of cuts to Social Security. He's gone on record saying he does not want that. And another thing that's curiously missing is any of Donald Trump's talking points on the campaign trail, as in no taxes on tips, no taxes on Social Security income, and no taxes on overtime pay. None of those areas which Trump has said he wants to implement have found themselves into this GOP budget proposal, which is fascinating and interesting to see, but we also have to understand that this proposal is coming from GOP members in Congress, not directly from the president. But of course, there are also areas where increased spending is proposed in this budget, and I also have an issue with that. There is a proposal for a roughly $300 billion increase, again, over the next 10 years, for military and defense spending, as well as border protection. And my issue with this is not that I don't think we should be the most powerful military on the planet. I, in fact, do. I think that it brings stability, for the most part, to the globe. With that said, our military is constantly, every single day, ripped off time and time again by military contractors. For example, $50,000+ for a single screw, $10,000+ for a single coffee machine. These are just two examples of how the military overspends, because military contractors know there's no competition and they can charge whatever they want. Back in the 80s, they were charging $600+ for single toilet seats. And the reason I bring that up is to show that it's been going on for decades. So when budget proposals have billions of dollars of increases for military spending, it kind of makes me question, how about instead we first and foremost have the Pentagon pass an audit? And secondly, how about instead we actually try to reduce waste and overspending to military contractors? Because in my opinion, in a perfect world where the Pentagon is audited and there's competition with these military contractors, we could probably cut the military budget, which is approaching $800 billion per year. We could probably cut that by 25%, 30%, 40%, and still have just as strong a military if these prices were in line with reality. It's very similar to the healthcare system where people spend $500-$600 on a single aspirin because these hospitals know they can charge whatever they want because it's just going to be billed to insurance. When there is unlimited money, people who are getting paid from that unlimited money source are obviously going to charge as much as they can. So let's give this budget proposal a grade. In my opinion, it gets a C-, and it would probably get an F if it wasn't for the fact that in this proposal, there is a stipulation. And that stipulation is that if the trillions of dollars in cuts cannot be made, well, then the tax cuts have to be reduced by a proportionate amount. With that said, I would still rather see those budget cuts elsewhere, not in Medicaid, and surely not in education, and probably also not in SNAP benefits, because those are going to help more and more the middle class. But if we've learned anything in American history, the military-industrial complex is extremely powerful and extremely lucrative, and I doubt that we will see any sort of reasonable cuts or any sort of audit being passed by the Pentagon anytime soon. And to wrap up this video, we also have to understand that this is the preliminary budget proposal. This is going to be negotiated, debated, back and forth, left and right, up and down, before the final version is actually submitted and potentially passed. Senate is working on their own, and who knows if Donald Trump will actually pass this bill or veto it if it doesn't contain some of the things that he wants. So while this first draft, in my opinion, gets a C-, barely passing, we'll have to see how it goes, and we'll have to wait for the final approved budget proposal. With that said, I hope you found this video informative. If you did, please consider subscribing. It helps out the channel tremendously. And if you like personal finance, world economics, and investing broken down simply, you are in the right place. So I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, take care.